Okay, Shalom Aleichem. Be'ezer Hashem, we're going to continue the Shiurim, and we're learning now a little bit about Magid. So before we start to learn a little bit more in depth about Magid, we'll just start off a little bit talking about the Hakdama to Magid. The Hakdama to Magid means the beginning of Magid. The beginning of Magid starts off with Lachma Anya. So we'll talk a little bit about this very particular passage, where it comes from, to understand a little bit the Hagdama, how we enter into the level of Magid, because we spoke a little bit last week that Mitzrayim represents the Meitzar HaGoren, the throat, the constrictions of the throat, and the idea of Magid is the redemption of speech, through which speech reaches a level of Geula. Therefore, the Ari HaKadosh writes that when we recite the Haggadah, we should say it with a loud and with a confident voice. And the Shalom HaKadosh says this should also be paradoxically also with a sense of trepidation and awe, because the Zohar tells us in the beginning of Shmois that on the night of Pesach, when we sit down to celebrate the Seder, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem alone, with this Palmaya Shalom, with the angels come, and they sit and they receive pleasure from the Seder night that we're spending and we're celebrating. So there's something very important about how we speak the Magid. And like we also mentioned last time, the Magid comes from the word connected to sweetening. That it's a process of sweetening through the metzah, through the constrictions, to come to a place of sweetening. So first we do yachatz. Inwardly, the avodah of yachatz, the inner work of yachatz, means that a person breaks himself in half and realizes that they're only a half a tzura, like the Torah of the Magid, that a person is only a half of an image, and the other half of the image, kaviyachol, is Hashem alone, the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, when we say Magid, it says Magid is not called Haggadah, but it's called Magid. Magid means as if it's coming on its own. It means that Hashem is talking through us. And therefore, when there's a child that's a child that doesn't have to ask a question, we say, At Psachloi, you open it up. At is the letters from Aleph to Taf, the Hebrew letters, the Lashon Kodesh, and At Psachloi means Malchus, the Shechina opens up, Bekana ben Shoel Ma. And here the child asks Ma. So before we start the idea of the Seder, before we start the idea of Magid, we are not going to go through the passages of Magid themselves in great length. Be'ezer Hashem, maybe next year we'll do that. We'll learn properly the Haggadah itself. But we were trying to go through the Simonei. Simonei HaSeder means the basic steps, the 15 steps in the Seder. So before we start the Seder, the first thing that we do, we sit down and we say a passage in Aramaic. This is unlike the rest of the Haggadah, which is mostly said in Hebrew, which is all said in Hebrew. This passage is said in Aramaic. And what do we say in this passage? We start off like this. We start off, Lachma Anya d'chol avosana b'ar Mitzrayim, or Lachma Anya. This is the bread that we ate, that our ancestors ate in Egypt. And there's two versions, two very famous versions of how this is written. Either this is written Lachma Anya, which means take this bread, or Lachma Anya. Now, in terms of the Sfirot, the idea of Tseir is connected to Bina, and Kametz is connected to Keser. So this is another reason why there's different customs how to say exactly, do we say or Hey? But let's we'll get to it in a second. So what do we say? Halach ma'an yachol avosam l'arbitzayim, or Halach ma'an yachol avosam l'arbitzayim. This is the bread of affliction that we ate in Egypt. Whoever is hungry, let them come and eat. This year we are in Ba'ar Hashta Hacha. This year we're here, which means we're in exile. Next year we'll be in Israel. Hashta Avdin. This year we're enslaved. Next year we will be Lashana Haba B'nei Chayrim. Next year we'll be B'nei Chayrim. We'll be free. So who are we speaking to? We're speaking to the people that are already congregated around our table. And we're telling them that now that you're sitting around the table, come, let's start the process of the Seder, let's start to eat. And it's a very important step that we do, and this is contrast to the way it was done during the times of the Beis HaMikdash, the times of the temple, because during the Beis HaMikdash time, it was impossible to invite someone for the Seder, because the Seder is connected to the Korban Pesach, the offerings of Pesach, and that was celebized. You had to be the menuya, you had to actually be someone that was dedicated to eat this offering. So we weren't able to do it, but now that we're sitting in exile, we can actually invite people to come. And the Chida brings down, Sheva Mukabalim, that when a person starts off the Seder, when he starts off this night, and the way they're starting off is to say that they're going to become a mashpia, not just a makabel, they're going to be mashpia, they're going to be a giver to the less fortunate. Whoever is hungry, whoever is thirsty, whoever is needy, please come eat. So right away, the Chida says the gates of heaven are of compassion are right away open, and a person is bestowed great kindness and godless and chesed. And this also is reminded of the same story that happened during the time of Egypt, where we're ein ani al b'das, we were in a state of the das, our consciousness was in a state of constriction, exile, and we were redeemed despite the fact that we didn't deserve it, and we were poor, and we weren't able to have it on our own, and we didn't work on it, we were given to us. So this is the first step of transformation. The first step of the Seder is to recognize that we're a mashpia, to give to the less fortunate, to ask ourselves, to ask for Hashem to fill us and say that even if we're hungry and inwardly if we're feeling the need and the lack, that we have a desire to change, filled with Hashem's blessings of freedom. Now let's start with the actual structure of the Lachma Anya, the Lachma Anya. So Lachma Anya starts off like this. The first thing we do notice is that we'll see that it's in Aramaic. Which is, again, it's unusual. So the question is, passage completely in Aramaic. If, again, like we're looking at the Rambam continuously, if you look in the Rambam's version, and Amram Gaon's version of Lachma Anya, or Lachma Anya, this entire passage is in Aramaic. In our version, the way we have it, Hashta Avdi, we say this year we are slaves, or enslaved, but we finish off the Lachma Anya by saying, L'shana haba b'nei chayrim. Next year we will be free, and we actually say this in the language of Lashon Kodesh, in the Hebrew language. So the whole thing switches, and we have to understand why. So first of all, why is this said in the Aramaic language versus the other parts of the Haggadah? And the simple answer is, like the Kol Boy brings down, and the Avudram brings down, is that this passage was created by Jews already living in exile during the Babylonian period. There was a period of time for about 1,000 years that the common Jewish language was Babylonian. Aramaic was the language of the Middle East for about 1,000 years. The language for people, both during the Greeks and the Roman periods, the people spoke this language. So even though there are parts of the Haggadah, major parts of the Haggadah, that are already found in the Talmud, which the Talmud is also the Gemara, which is written post Second Temple, and those are written in Hebrew. And the simple answer is because those parts of the Haggadah were written much earlier, and they're also connected to parts of the Haggadah that were actually recited during the Second Temple period. However, this part of the Haggadah was this Lachma Anya, this introduction of opening up and saying this is the bread of affliction, was living already in Babylon, and therefore it was written in the language of the vernacular that people could understand, that people should understand what the Haggadah is. And this is interesting because it's brought down in the Shulchan Aruch. The Torah brings it down in the name of Kolonimus, one of the great Rishonim before the expulsion of Jews in London in 1290, that he used to recite the Haggadah in English. This is ancient English in the 1290s. That means that the Haggadah was very important, that we should understand what we're saying. So this is why we say it in this language. So, but the only question is, why do we change it at the end? We start off saying, Lachma Anya, this is the bread of affliction, whoever is hungry, let him come and eat, etc. This year we're here, next year we'll be in Israel. This year we're here, next year, next year we'll be free, and we switch the language into into the language of Lashon HaKodesh, to Hebrew. Why do we switch that language? This is a question. So the Kolboy writes, one of the Rishonim writes, that the point was that we should not say next year will be free. The intention was so people, the local authorities in Babylon, should not think that this was some type of call to arms or some type of rebellion. So if we would say next year and that next year will be free, it sounds like we're trying to say that we're going to start rebelling on this Pesach. So to do that, we switch it into Lashon Kodesh. This is what the Kolboy writes. So obviously the question is, who are the authorities that are sitting at the Seder? Why are they at the Seder? And if they're at the Seder, we can explain to them that it doesn't mean that. It means that Hashem should redeem us. It doesn't mean that it's a call for arms. And the bigger problem is, like the Maharal points out in Gvuras Hashem, Nun Aleph, they says that we say next year, Lashana Haba B'Ardi Yisrael, we say next year in Israel, we do say it in Aramaic. And so people do this, so they will understand what that means. So it's obviously not that. That cannot be the reason. This is one question. To understand this switching of languages, and we'll understand there's some great depth to this idea of Lashon original, the origin or the original language versus the translational language. We have to understand, what does it mean, Hashta Avde? This year we're in slaves. We're saying that this year we're slaves. And next year we'll be free. But isn't the whole idea of the Seder to celebrate freedom? So why are we talking about slavery? Even if we're talking about our mental, spiritual, emotional, physical oppression that we may be experiencing, but why do we start the Seder with that? If tonight is all about the freedom. So let's go through the passage. The passage has three basic ideas. First idea is saying that this is the bread in Egypt. Number one. Second thing that we say, whoever's hungry and whoever is needy, let them come and eat with us. That's number two. Number three, we say this year we're here, this year we're enslaved, next year we'll be free, next year we'll be in Israel. These are the three passages that we have to understand. Like we said, many Mukubalim, many Kabbalists, like the Chidah, the Ben Ish Chai, and a lot of the Sfardim Mukubalim based on the Arizal, and the Ari himself in the Nusach of the Ari, we say not Lachma Anya, but Lachma Anya. The difference between ha and hey is, besides that grammatically it means something else. Hey means take this bread that we ate in Egypt. Lachma Anya means this is the bread that we ate in Egypt. Like we said, that ha is connected, the vowels are connected to the spheres. So the vowel of kometz, it has to do with a high level of keter, of kati lezer, that you're closing down, is connected to the vowel. So ha is kometz, and hey is tseire. And the hey, the Arizal connects to hey l'chazera, which Yosef said when he gave the seed to the Egyptians when they were complaining that. So hey l'chazera, this is a tikkun for that, which we spoke about in the past many times. This is the difference between these two versions. The classic version of the Arizal, which is also the Chabad version, is to say Hey Lachma Anya. It's interesting that the Rebbe Rashab, fifth Chabad Rebbe, used to sometimes, most of the times he would actually say Hey Lachma Anya, but sometimes he would also say Ha to connect to that sphere of Kesser. But let's try to understand what actually this passage means. What does this mean? Hey Lachma Anya. What does it actually mean? So we say this is that our ancestors ate in Mitzrayim. But the question is, what does it mean this is the bread? This is not the bread. This is thousands of years later. It's not that bread. So therefore, the Magen Avraham writes, in Tafai and Gimel, the Magen Avraham brings down that, Tafai and Gimel Chavdalai brings down that there's certain people that don't want to say the word Hey Lachma Anya or Ha Lachma Anya. They say Kiha. This is similar to the bread that we ate in Egypt. So they don't say the word Ha Lachma Anya or Hey Lachma Anya, but it's similar to the bread. Just like that's like in Egypt, we ate this bread. The same thing also, we're eating this poor bread. And the Magen Avram concludes, and he talks about this, whether this means literally or not, when you say ha or hey, this is it. And he says that therefore a person that says kiha lo hifsid didn't really do something negative, but it's not such a bad idea. Now the reason for the Magen Avram's ruling is the Magen Avram has his reasoning, because the Magen Avram says that ha doesn't actually mean this, but the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch writes something interesting. It says, yes, medaktikim leimer kiha Lachma Anya or ha Lachma Anya or ha ki Lachma. There are those who say kiha, like this is the bread that we ate in Egypt, or ha, this is like ki Lachma Anya, because this is not actually the bread that we actually ate in Egypt. Lefikach, the Alter Rebbe writes, therefore, even though the regular nusach, the regular version of this passage is ha Lachma Anya, however, someone who says like this bread, or ha ki Lachma, this is like this bread, lo hifsid, didn't ruin anything, and it's not such a bad idea. The obvious question is on Alter Rebbe is, why specifically do we say that? Why you should specifically say kiha, like this? Why would you say ha Lachma Anya? This is the bread, when it's in fact not the bread. In other words, why the version should have been changed. Kiha, like this bread, not ha Lachma Anya. This is the actual bread. We have to understand it. The second question is, let's say that the reason why we say ha Lachma Anya or hey Lachma Anya, this is the bread, is because we say later in the Agada, which we bring every generation, every year, a person every day has to experience the going out of Egypt as if they himself went out of Egypt. So therefore you can say that when you say this is the bread as we left Egypt, I'm experiencing right now the going out of Egypt. So my experience of the going out of Egypt, now this is the bread that I ate. And this is what the Rebbe actually is medayik and says this is the reason for the ruling of the Alter Rebbe. But so that's why we can say this, because it actually we're really experiencing the going out of Egypt. Okay. The only problem is a klotzkash, a very simple question. What does it mean? This is the bread of affliction that we ate in Egypt. Since when did we eat matzah in Egypt? When did we eat the matzah? We ate matzah on the night that we left Egypt. When we were leaving Egypt, that's when we ate the matzah. We didn't eat the matzah in Egypt, not as slaves. We didn't eat matzah as slaves. And again, if you look in the version of the Rambam, which I hope some of you have in front of you, you'll see that when the Rambam writes this halacha, this law, he writes, Bibehilu yatzanu mimitzrayim. He has an introduction. He says, in great haste we left Egypt. This is the bread of affliction that we ate in Egypt. Which means, according to the Rambam, what the Rambam is basically doing, he's saying is, this is not actually the bread that we ate. This is the bread that we ate as we were leaving Egypt, which is pshat. Okay, our version doesn't have that. So therefore, we have to understand, what does it mean that this is the bread of affliction that we ate in Egypt? So the pasuk in Devarim Tezayin Gimel says like this: Lo seichel of chametz, shivas yamim teichel of matzos, lechem oini. Ki b'chipazin yatzum im eretz Mitzrayim, because we left in great haste. Which means that why do we eat the matzah? Remember what we talked about from Gamliel, the narrative of the story why we eat the matzah? The story why we eat the matzah was because we left in great haste. So when we left Egypt, we ate the matzah, not in Egypt. However, the Even Ezra, and it's quoted by the Abarbanel, and it's quoted by the Shalach Kodesh, and others quote, writes that in Egypt we actually ate matzah. Where does we see that we eat matzah? So the story is of the Even Ezra that he was a prisoner. He was on a boat and he was captured by bandits and he was placed in a prison in India somewhere, and he was fed these matzahs, these flat breads. And he said when he ate the bread, he realized that this bread lasts in the stomach for a much longer period of time than regular bread. And he realized that probably this is the reason what it means that this is the bread of affliction that we ate in Egypt. That means that the Egyptians fed us matzah, not bread. This is what the Even HaEzer writes. And the Sephorna, which is also from the later Rishonim, he writes on this pasuk in Dvarim. He says, "Lechem Anya, lechem shoya oichlim ba'Anya, shaloi hoya lepnai l'shayis sasam achetachus me noiksham atzim." That the Sephorna writes that the nature of slaves is, even if they're breaking their own bread, they bake it very quickly because they don't have time in their hands. Because they don't have time in their hands, they do things in a rush. So therefore, the slaves actually ate matzah in Mitzrayim. This is what the Even HaEzer writes, and this is what the Sephorna writes. Either because it lasts in the stomach for a longer period of time, or because a slave doesn't own his own time, so therefore he has to do things in great haste, and because he has to do things in great haste, he doesn't allow his bread to rise. Now it's interesting that chametz in general, this is Tosis and Zvachim, Ayin Hey, the idea of bread that's risen, and the Netziv brings it down in Nimir Shefer on the Agada, is that chametz in general, the idea of chametz, of bread that rises, represents a food of royalty, because it represents leisure, that there's time and you have processes, which with matzah means you have to do it very quickly. So it means that there's no options. They have to do things very quickly. It means that they were enslaved. Contrary to the idea of chametz, which is loyalty. And what's even really more interesting is that the Egyptians were the first people to actually learn how to ferment bread and wheat and yeast. So the whole idea of bread itself, the concept of bread, is actually an Egyptian idea. But who ate bread? Who ate the Besser mentioned, the better people, the slave owners ate the bread. What did they give the slaves? Like the Even HaEzer says, either they gave the matzah because it's basic ingredients, or they told them to bake your own bread, or they give them the least ingredients possible, and it took the quickest period of time. And that's why the bread, the matzah, represents bread of affliction. Hey, Lachma Anya, this is bread of affliction that we ate in Egypt, represents bread of affliction. And the Echtzachus, you can say that bread, matzah, actually goes through a whole process of being beaten and afflicted. You first on the flour with the water, then you push it down, you make it flat, and then you poke holes in it, and then it's punctured and it's thrown into the fire. So it goes through a process of beating. The entire idea of matzah represents bread of affliction. Now, this is one of the reasons, these are the reasons that, according to Even HaEzer and the Sephorna, why we call this bread of affliction. Comes the Maral in Gvuras Hashem, Nun Aleph, and the Maral says, where do you learn this? How does the Even HaEzer know this? This is not mentioned in the Torah anywhere. It doesn't mention in the Torah anywhere that the Jews ate matzah in Mitzrayim, that as slaves they ate matzah. It doesn't say anywhere. And second of and he says, no, that's not the reason. It cannot be the reason. The Torah would have told us this is the reason why it's called matzah, because we ate it in Mitzrayim. So he says, no, that the reason why matzah is called lechem Anya, ma ani beprusa, so the idea of ani represents a poor man's bread. He says because matzah has the least ingredients possible. It's because it's so raw and it's just flour and water, it represents the poor man's bread. But paradoxically, it also represents the free man. Why? What is the difference between someone what's a free person versus a person that's not a free person? What's the different definition of a person that's not free? Is a person that his life is intermingled and is mixed up with another person. Which means when your life is not your own, you don't own your life. There's a master, there's someone that's enforcing you, maybe it's a boss or someone that's an abusive personality, and this person is ruling your life. So inwardly, also the same also with our emotions. If our emotions are guiding us or forcing us to be a certain way, even though our minds understands that from an objective place we shouldn't be this way, and we're enslaved to our emotions, which means that we're using our life. We need other ingredients to choose for us, which means the life becomes mixed with others. So the Maral says that the definition of matzah Anya versus matzah Ashira, poor man bread, is when there's no milk and sugar and eggs or anything else, and it's just simple. But the simplicity means that it's free. There's a difference between being the cause of your life, which we said that's the tachlis, that the intention of the Seder is to get to a place beyond Seder, so we could be the cause, not the effect of life. And the effect is to be a slave or enslaved. It could be external slavery, internal slavery, whatever that means you are in the effect of life. The same thing also with the idea of time, says the Maharal. If I say that in order for this cake or this bread to be fully baked, it needs a certain amount of time. It needs a half hour, 40 minutes, whatever long it takes. It means that in order to exist, it needs something outside of itself. Something that has less time or needs less time and needs less ingredients represents something that's more free, because it could just be without all the elements of time and space. Same thing also with matzah. The fact that matzah is simple, the fact that matzah is just flour and water and takes the minimum of time to rise, minimum of time to become, represents freedom. So the Maharal is saying that what the bread of Anya is actually bread of freedom. So let's take these two interpretations together, saying that the Ibn Ezra's interpretation and the Sephorah with the Maharal. What it means is like this, that in the depth of their slavery, in the matzah that they ate because it lasts in the stomach for a longer period of time, and the matzah they ate because they had no time to rise, that in itself is the kernel of their freedom, the source of their freedom, the light that comes. Freedom is precisely in that place. The remedies within the sickness. And this is why the idea of haste, when you look at the idea of haste, of zrizus or behilu, like the Rambam writes, behilu means like in great haste and in commotion, could be something that's negative. It could be unfocused. The idea of Aniya Marti b'chavzi kol adam koizev, someone talks with great haste, like the Baal Shem Tov says, "Vavalta mehera." You have to lose the mehera, the quickness, because that represents something that's not settled. Just you do it right away, you don't understand what you're doing, and without consciousness and without thoughtfulness. And then there's something that's called zrizos b'masinos. You could do something in great haste with great calmness, with great mindfulness, great presence, which means you do things right away when it has to be done, but don't do it before it has to be done. So haste itself, we have these two elements. It could be something that's a negative thing. It could represent a person that's not conscious, that doesn't have das, doesn't have awareness, or lacks awareness, therefore everything is in chaos. Or it represents someone that does something exactly when it should be done. Like zrizas, the proper idea of alacrity, proper idea of doing something quickly. Like Avram Avinu, when he's told, we learn zrizas from Avram Avinu, and but the night before he goes to sleep. He's told to bring the Akedah, Yitzchak to the Akedah by night, but that night he goes to sleep very peacefully, and he sleeps very nicely. He gets up in the morning, which is when he starts, when he knows when he can start journeying, which is in the morning. That's when he gets up to do things in the correct time. So this is the idea of the bread, Lachma Anya. So when we say Lachma Anya chalav v'sanam, let's go back to, we say this is the bread of affliction that we ate in Egypt. So what this means is that we have these two interpretations. Either we'll say this, in fact, is the bread of Egypt, like we said, because it's the bread of a slave. It's a bread that lasts in the stomach for a long period of time, and a bread doesn't have time to rise. But however, we would say, like the Rambam writes, that it represents the bread that we ate as we're leaving Egypt. And if you look at the Ramak, Ramosha Kadavero and Tfilul Moshe, so he says, when you say, Lachma Anya chalav v'sanam, this is the bread of affliction, he says, we're not talking literally about the matzah itself. We're talking about everything. The whole idea of the Seder, raw vegetables and an egg and salt water, all these foods that represent charesis, all these foods that represent cement and hardship and difficulties, these are the foods that we ate. But simply, the pshat of the literal interpretation of this means, Lachma Anya chalav v'sanam, this is literally the bread that we ate. So we can say like this, we'll take both these interpretations, both the bread that we ate as we're leaving Egypt, or as we left Egypt, which represents bread of freedom, and the bread ate as slaves in Egypt, and we'll say that it represents the place of in-between, as we're leaving Egypt. There's a process where things are changing. If you look at the prusa, the broken matzah, and you look at the Torah Arizal, the Arizal writes that you break the matzah, which we spoke when we talked about yachatz. You break the matzah and you break it into two halves. One half is broken into the shape of a daled, and the other half is shaped like a little vav. Together, that's the letter Hey. But when they're broken in half, the daled represents dal, which is poor. And what you do with that broken piece of matzah, that becomes the afikomen. So you hide it, you tuck it away, you put it away for tzafon, you hide it. And what the idea of the hiding is that it's a state of ibur, it's in a state of pregnancy, which means it's hidden away and it's developing, it's forming. Then we go through the whole process of magid, which is from the Meitzar Gar, from the place of constriction, we're receiving godless. And comes at the end of the Seder, or the end of the afikomen, and we eat it. When we finally eat the afikomen, we actually bring those two parts of the matzah that were broken apart, and said it was like a broken dalet and vav, and now they're shalom, they become part of the hay again. They become part of the godless, which means the process through which the poor man's bread, the bread of affliction, actually becomes the bread of redemption. And this is what happens. So there's a delicate balance between these two, between being bread of affliction and bread of slavery and bread in the state of slavery. And then there's the process of this becoming actually the bread of freedom, like the Maharal writes. And this is the in-between state. We left, as we're leaving Egypt, between the state of Egypt, which is katnas, and the state of godless, which is leaving Egypt, in this in-between state, that's when we're starting to eat this, that's when we're eating this bread. Just like Yocheved, the mother of Moshe, was born between the Chaima, in that in-between place, because in order for redemption to occur, you needed Moshe Rabbeinu, who was born from a person that was partly born outside of slavery in Eretz Yisrael, or coming from Eretz Yisrael, and part Mitzrayim. Moshe himself is Yarkein Ish. That Moshe looks this way and that way, which means that Moshe is born as a Jew but raised as an Egyptian, which means that he has also this two identities which can merge both freedom and slavery. And in that place of in-between, that's where redemption occurs. That's where we have to eat the matzah. And matzah represents this unity between these two ideas, between matzah ani and prusa, darkeb ani, that idea of bread of affliction and bread of poverty, and also the bread of redemption. And that's why, again, going back to the Rambam rules, and Rambam Gaon rules, that when you eat the matzah, you dip it into charois. Charois represents the cement and represents the slavery, like the Gemara says in Pesachim. So why do we dip the matzah, which represents the bread of freedom, which we're going to eat later, charois? Because that's the unity between these two opposites. And this is how we begin. We say, Lachma Anya, this is the bread of affliction, and we recognize that there is still a state of affliction, that the world is still not redeemed, that the place of the world, maybe we feel ourselves more free, but the world itself is not free. And we're saying that this bread itself represents or embodies the same quality that was the bread of affliction, is also in its kernel is the bread of redemption. And this is why we continue to say, Kol dechvin yesav yecha, whoever's hungry, let them come and eat. What are we saying? We're saying there's a possibility in the world for hunger, for affliction. There are people that are starving, people that are not satiated. So we look to the world and say that tonight we're celebrating freedom, tonight we're celebrating the idea of cherus, and yet there are people, by contrast, that have nothing. So first of all, you give them something. And generally, mashakana evikana rabbi, what a slave receives, his owner receives, because their life is intermingled. But here we say that you can actually receive something. It's already a gift that you can receive. But on a deeper level, what we're saying is like this, that we're sitting down to the Seder to say that tonight is a night of freedom, and we start off by saying this is the bread of affliction, this is the bread of poverty, and tonight there are people that are still starving. Because we're saying that even though this is the bread of affliction, just like the bread of affliction had the kernel of redemption, the same thing also tonight, the reason why we're celebrating tonight, despite the fact that we're still in exile, is because in the depth of tonight, of the depth of night tonight is the kernels of redemption. And this is what we say. This year we're in exile. Next year we'll be in Jerusalem. Next year we'll be free. Hashta l'shana haba b'Eretz Yisrael. Hashta hach l'shana haba b'Eretz Yisrael. This year we're here. Next year we'll be in the land of Israel. Hashta avin. This year we're slave. Next year we'll be shana b'nei cherem. They were saying that there's a movement between. We're embarking on the Seder, and we're thinking about what was going on, and we're saying yes, that maybe we're now slaves, and maybe we're now not in a redemptive state, and maybe we're not in our homeland. But L'shana haba, next year, what does next year mean? Next year means tonight. In this moment, in the next moment, we're already we can already experience freedom, and we already will experience freedom. Because the beginning of redemption occurs in that moment of the darkness. And tonight is the night of going out of Egypt. So even in the fact that we feel ourselves hungry, we feel ourselves needy, and we feel the hunger of the world, and we feel the deprivation and the affliction of the world. That is it's bread of affliction, but it's also bread of freedom. And tonight, even though we feel l'shana shata hacha, we feel here, we know that next year, which next year is next moment, we're going to experience redemption. And this is why we conclude with Lashon Kodesh. Why do we conclude with Lashon Kodesh? L'shana shata hacha. Shata, and then we say shana. There's a change. There's going to be a change that's going to happen. That there's a reality where redemption and connection and rootedness is we're already experiencing. And Pesach opens up that gate for that freedom. Pesach opens up the gate for that yichud. In general, the difference between Lashon Kodesh, the holy language, versus the other languages of the world, that the holy language represents the language of creation, the language of revelation, and the language of redemption. Targum, translation of language, represents an exile state. This is what Arizal writes in Shagavanos and Kaddish, and Shalom brings down in Psachim, that the whole idea of Targum, of translation, represents the backside. The Ramak also brings down in his Pirush that we start off with Aramaic. It's like the Sorah HaMishtalech that we're giving to the other side, to the Sitra Acher, like the same thing like we do on Yom Kippur like the Zohar says and the Ramban says. But the idea of it is that Aramaic, which is a translation of the Hebrew, represents the other side. Represents the side that's still in exile. So we start off in saying that even our language is in exile. Even our ability to speak is in exile, and is in exile. That the redemptive language itself is in exile. Or else to truly experience our freedom, we're this year here, l'shana haba, next year we'll be free. We speak it in the Lashon Kodesh. We speak it of creation, revelation, and of redemption. This idea that we start off saying in the language of Aramaic goes back even to the Yetzias Mitzrayim itself, the going out of Egypt itself. When Klal Yisrael were leaving Egypt, the language of revelation, which is through Matan Torah, was still in exile. And that language, even though L'shinu L'shoinam, but the idea of the language, the full expression of that language, like we spoke previously in Magid, that the whole idea of that the language is in exile, there's a Galus HaDibur, that Dibur only becomes revealed, is the Torah. So the language itself is going through the process of an exile and a redemption. Now let's go a little bit deeper. We said before that this bread that we eat on the night of tonight, that we speak about, hey, Lachma Anya, this is the bread of affliction. We say that this bread itself has both these elements. Has the elements of of exile and of affliction and prusa, brokenness, and also has the kernel of its freedom, which means that it's a bridge that links these two. And this is interesting. This is what Aramaic is. The Maral, Yechidush HaGodus and Soita at the end writes that Aramaic is one of these languages is that it doesn't belong to any nation. It says that it's a language that belongs to all. When the Gemara says in Megillah that it's a Umash Eilam Ksav Loshen, it's a people that don't have a language and a written alphabet. So the Maral explains that this is a language that belongs to everybody, which means that Aramaic itself is sort of the intermediary language. It's the language through which Chazal, our sages, actually spoke the Gemara. It's the language that was written, which means that even though it's not Lashon HaKodesh, the full redemptive language, it's the language that bridges these two worlds of the elevation of the 70 languages of the world into the language of Lashon Kodesh. So this is actually the same concept of the matzah itself, that the matzah, which is the matzah of affliction, the matzah of anius, is actually the same matzah that brings us to the place of freedom. So it's the bridge that's moving us to that place. And that's what we do on the Seder night. We say, now let's go back slowly to what we said. We start off the Seder saying, with the recognition that the world is not redeemed. The world is not redeemed. Things are not good. Things are not in its perfect state. There's still exile. There's still people that are hungry. There are people that are thirsty. People that are needy. One of those people that are needy. Spiritually, we're needy. And we have that desire to be filled. But we start off in saying, so then why are we celebrating the Seder? If we don't have any freedom, what's the objective of the Seder? We're saying, just like the Mitzrayim, just like in Egypt. This is the bread of affliction that we ate in Egypt, which with this was the bread that we ate because we were slaves in Egypt. Because this is the bread that lasts in the stomach for a longer period of time. This is a bread that we can eat that doesn't need any time to rise, which represents a bread that we just have. This is a bread that's a bread of slavery. Yet, as the Maral says, this bread that's a poor man's bread, because it has no ingredients, it has no time, is actually the bread of freedom. So we say, despite the fact that we feel ourselves enslaved, internally or externally, emotionally, existentially, physically, emotionally, any level that we're experiencing, despite the fact that we see that the world is not in a redeemed state, we should know that this is the bread. Tonight we're going to celebrate this matzah, this matzah. Even though it's thousands of years later, it's the same kedusha with the same holiness, the same spirituality. This matzah has, like the matzah that Klal Yisrael ate when they left Egypt. We're going to eat this matzah and say that this is the bread that is an affliction. Yes, it's poor man's bread, but this is the bread that's the kernel of our freedom. So why are we celebrating today? Why are we celebrating tonight? We're celebrating because despite the fact that we feel ourselves in exile, we can cross over that bridge, move from the place of exile to redemption, move from a place from questions to answers, move from a place from katnas, constriction and small and meitzer and limitations, to a place of merchav, to a place of expansion. This is what we're eating, and this is what we're celebrating. Hashem gave us the gift. We can experience godless. And even though Hashata Havdin, this year we're slaves and this year we're here, Lashana Haba, our language will be free. Our expressions will be free. Lashana Haba B'nei Chayim, we could speak in the Hebrew language, in the original language of creation. We could speak in the language of redemption, the language of revelation, the language of creation. We all are becoming redeemed. This is the process of what we're experiencing tonight as we're celebrating. So Lashana Haba B'nei Chayim, next year will be free. It's not just a wish and a hope and a desire. It's a confirmation. We're saying it. We're creating it. Lashana B'nei Chayim, tonight is the night that we receive our freedom. And this is the of the entire Seder. That before we even start to recognize what we're doing and how through tonight we can experience godless. And this is the next thing that we're going to go very quickly, with just a few minutes, we'll talk about this very quickly, then we'll go, that the idea of the whole Seder starts off with Manishtana, with a question. Now, what exactly is Manishtana? Why specifically these 4 questions? And who asked the questions? Which we talked a little bit last time. But the saying is that tonight is a night of questions. That if you have a child, the child asks you a question. And if you don't have a child, your wife asks the question. If you don't have a wife, you ask yourself the question, but it has to come through a question. A question is an uncertainty. A question represents exile, something that's locked, something that's not revealed. And then you have to ask. The main thing is to ask, like the Rambam writes, we pour the second cup, and now the child asks the question, the child has asked the question. And the reader of the Haggadah asks, but what the child is asking, what is this night different? Period. Forget about the details of this night. And the Maram Panu writes, that the real question, and the only question that the child is asking, and everything that we do is for the child to ask that question, for us to ask the question, is why is this night the order different? Why is this night, are we gifted godless before Katniss? That's the question. Why this night is the night of our freedom? Why this night could we achieve freedom? Why this night could we be free? Why this night could we be B'nai Chorim? This is what the question that the child is asking. Why can we reach a place of yichud, of clarity? He wants to understand this question, and this is what we have to bring out. Through the Magid, we have to speak about it to reveal that godless. And the question is, Ma nishtana halayla zeh? What is halayla zeh? Halayla is language of feminine. Hazeh is the language of masculine. In general, shir or shir represents masculine or feminine song. The idea of the masculinity, not men or women, masculinity represents something that's certain, that's the redemptive state, that's Zohar. Malchus represents a state that's constantly in a state of flux, of being filled, of desire, of chukka, of yearning, of longing. Tonight, halayla is hazeh. Tonight, the feminine is actually the masculine. We have godless immediately. And that's the question, ma nishtana, why? What is happening about tonight? And the answer is because tonight is like the night that we left Egypt. Tonight we're gifted to receive freedom. And this is the ultimate, what we go through the entire Agada. And then we finally get, and we're not going to go through the Agada because we really want to go through the Simonei Agada. We get finally to the end of the Agada, almost to the final part before we do the blessing, is we say Dayenu. What is Dayenu? Dayenu means enough. This is a small passage that many people say that goes back to the times the Beis Hamikdash already was composed, and we don't know exactly who composed it. It's interesting that in the Rambam's Agada, the Rambam himself does not have Dayenu in the Agada, enough this passage of Dayenu, but the Rambam's son, or Rambam writes that his father actually did say Dayenu, and that was the minig of Sfard, of Jews in Egypt, of Jews in Sfard in Spain, to say. So everyone asks questions about Dayenu. In all the Dayenus, we're not going to get into the details, because I want to talk about the general idea. Talk about of Dayenu, we say, if we brought us to Mount Sinai, we didn't give us the Torah, Dayenu was big enough. Or if we went through the sea and the sea wouldn't split, it would also be, would also been enough. So everyone asks the question, what does that mean? What will we achieve? And there's a lot of terutzim, there's a lot of different answers to these questions. But there's a bigger answer to the question that answers all the questions. And that is Dayenu actually means it's enough. That's it. It's enough. It's not enough? Okay, it's not enough from the perspective that it's not enough. On the Seder. There's one level of the Seder where we're talking about we want to change and everything has to change and we have to move into the future and we're desiring into the future and Magid, we're building up the vessels for the God. And then there's a higher level that's revealed on Pesach night, which you're ready, that you are redeemed already. That it's already Gula. That you already experienced Gula Pratis, that the future is ready in the present. Vidayenu, and it's enough. From the place of lack and the place of desire and the place of longing, the place of katniss and the place of questions, it's still not enough. That's true. That's from the place where there's still longing. But the place from Dayenu, it's enough. And this is what ultimately we get to the point of the Dayenu. The Dayenu, therefore there are 15 steps in Dayenu, corresponding to the 15 steps of the Simonei HaSeder. So it's like a conclusion of that idea. When we come to the final level of the 15th step of the Seder, we say Nirtza. Nirtza means it's already accepted. We arrived. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to do. We already reached the peak. That's the level of revelation, where we already experienced the redemption in the present. So this is what is connected to Magid and what we're supposed to do in the Agada. And then, of course, is the bigger parts of the Agada, which we're not going to talk about it. Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach, tomorrow, we'll continue the final part of Magid, which is Halal. Just as because Halal will be divided into two, we'll now talk about the second part of Halal when it comes to Halal and Nirtza. And we'll talk in Nirtza Shem, Matzah and Moira and Korach and further on until we get through all the Simonei HaSeder. Okay. Zachariah?
Shkoyach, Rav.
So,
if anybody has a question, they can raise their hand in the more. I'm clicking on the more button. We have a question from Kyle.
Yeah.
Zelda.
Yeah.
The Rav spoke about the difference between Liros and Laharos in Nusach Chabad, and in Nusach Ashkenaz we just say Liros. So what's the difference between Liros and Laharos compared to Liros?
It's not Nusach Chabad per se, it's actually the Nusach of the Rambam. There's different nuschos of liras and laharis. Liras means to show yourself, and laharis means to show others. And that's another big question of like, what is the ikar HaSeder? Is the ikar HaSeder to experience it yourself? Or vegat l'bincha, that's also part of the ikar HaSeder. So that's the difference in the nusachos if it's liras or laharis. That will be what the basic difference. But that's not so relevant to. The main thing we should be liras or laharis. Should be both. Should be yaitza both days.
I have a question for Rav Shlomo.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask in Parak Shmini from the Rambam.
Yeah.
In base, he says something interesting. Maybe
Yeah.
the Rav addressed it and I missed it, but
Yeah.
So, is there really, according to the Rambam, there's a movement of the table itself as well?
Yeah, but that's a Gemara. The Gemara says Orkim HaShulchan. The Gemara Kuftes Vav says Orkim HaShulchan. We don't do that because they used to eat very differently than we do in the Western world. They ate on the ground, more like Arabic style, and they had these little tables in front of them. So Orkim HaShulchan was they prepared it and then they pushed it away and then they said they agada. We don't do that because we sit at a big table with. But it's interesting that the Mukabalim write B'Shem Ari that on Shabbos, of course, you have to have a table that has 4 legs. It's very pointed and 4 legs. So the Mukabalim bring down that actually this is also the minhag that we should do on Pesach night specifically. But those days used to have it wasn't like a table. It was like they used to lie like on a couch and it used to be like a small little table in front of them. So every person had a private little table and you were oiker that shulchan. But that's the Gemara. The Gemara says oiker shulchan. We learned it from Abaye and Rav. Remember? That Rav was oiker shulchan. Abaye asked him the question, why oiker shulchan? Yeah.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Where did the minhag of the hard matzah come from? Because it seems quite impractical, and you have to be very delicate that it shouldn't even break. So it seems like the floppy Sephardi matzahs would be the one, but where?
This is the minhag Yisrael today. The minhag Ashkenaz, I should say. The Yemenites, I think, still have a soft, like a lava. They put it on this, they bake it on this hot iron or something. The minhag Ashkenaz, and the basic reason how this minhag Ashkenaz developed has to do with, it used to be that people used to bake matzah Erev Pesach. And that was the hiddur. Some people try to do this even today, to try to bake matzah Erev Pesach. As communities grew, it was impossible to bake matzah Erev Pesach, everybody. So they had to figure out a way how they could bake matzah that could stay somewhat fresh for a month from now. And the simple solution to that is to bake hard matzah. If you bake soft matzah, like a pita, you'll see the pizza gets moldy very, very quickly. So in Ashkenaz, a lot of these more industrial areas, they started baking more a hard matzah so it can last for longer periods of time, which a minhag Yisrael Tairu, and also that's taka, we say that matzah lasts longer. So like the Even Ezra says, it lasts longer in the stomach, so it lasts longer actually on the shelf also. It could be also, this is part of the matzah Anya, the poor man's bread, that it just lasts infinitely longer than a regular.
I think we have one more question from Shlomo, and
Sure.
that's it.
Okay. Yeah.
Also, I once heard from Rav in Eretz Yisrael that if you were to leave Mitzrayim, you're not leaving Mitzrayim, the matzah that we have now is going to get crushed. It's not going to crumble. I mean, it doesn't. So I guess functionally for now it makes sense, but it just seems like it must have been originally a softer bread.
It was for sure. That's not a shiloh. It's for sure a softer bread. It's not a shiloh. All Yidden ate softer bread when there was availability to bake immediately and eat the matzah. Had to do with like a technical thing. That the Rambam, the Gemara says chayt v'samatzah. Some people, according to the Rambam, chayt v'samatzah means actually sling it over your shoulder. You sling a hard matzah over your shoulder, it breaks. Okay, this is a different minhag Yisrael. And not even Arab pashta. If this is your minhag, you should continue eating hard matzah. Maybe you should help. They should have enough strength to chew through the
There's
matzah.
one more question from Isaiah. I don't know if they're
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Shalom Rav, thank you so much. I was going to ask specifically on the question of hard matzah, soft matzah. to a point where some people have different minhagim at a table. Is it usher for someone who's Ashkenaz to partake in a Yemenite or Sephardi style matzah, or what? I mean, maybe it's its own share in the sense of like, what are then?
It's a big shaila. It's a big shaila. It's a big shaila. The question is, if you had a minig, if you're a Baal Tshuva, if you had a minig of Isenu, like you had a minig of your father, if you're married to a Sephardi girl, there's a lot of different. In general, I just want to say, the klolos, very, very generally speaking, it's easier to change from minig Ashkenaz to minig Sfard. Like, for example, in Nusach HaTfilah, than to change from Sfard to Ashkenaz. More poskim are more lenient moving from Ashkenaz to Sfard than Sfard to Ashkenaz. But you can't pick and choose. You can't say, okay, for this, I'm going to be Yemenite, and then, but I'm not going to eat kitnius, and you can't. There has to be consistency in terms of your minig. So once someone's married, or someone's a Baal Tshuva, or a ger, someone's going through a process, you can figure that out. But in general, we should try to keep to our custom that this is the way we eat, this is the way Ashkenazim ate matzah, this is the way we'll eat. And remember, you're eating the matzah, this is the way the matzah the Baal Shem Tov ate, the matzah the Gra ate, the matzah all the Rebbe's ate. There's also a very big yidden that ate. So we're in a good company. Seder. So Be'ez Hashem, tomorrow we'll continue with Hala Moitzi Matzah Mora Korach. Bezat Hashem. Okay, sehr gesund.